Thank you very much, Caroline, and hello, everyone. Welcome to NUS PhD eOpen Day. I have to say, going into this talk, I'm just a humble social scientist, and listening to the talks this afternoon and earlier today from great, genuine scientists, people who are uncovering deep mathematics, people who are after the cure for cancer, it is very humbling. I want to talk to you about inequality. And I want to talk to you about the politics of envy. That's something that, as a social scientist, I do feel qualified to do. But that talk about inequality and the politics of envy, really, it is just an excuse. Because the deep reason that I want to talk to you, that I'm standing here before you, is I want to talk to you about your doing a PhD at NUS in the social sciences, about your becoming an academic and a scholar, possibly as an economist, of which I'm a professor of economics, or possibly in the School of Public Policy, a school that studies and helps train people who form public policies on curing cancer, finding more efficient ways to move things around, helping ameliorate global climate change, helping regulate artificial intelligence. Now, what right do I have to say this? I'm an economist and therefore a social scientist. And in my view, academics, scholars in my area, I want to think about us as heroes. We're heroes in a romantic landscape. We're heroes in a romantic landscape who have one job. And that job is to breathe life into a quaint and noble notion, to speak truth to power. Now, there's of course a popular view on this. For many, speaking truth to power means angry citizens standing up against political repression, or it means the more noble-hearted among us sacrificing ourselves to protect humanity from corporate abuse and greed. But in my talk this evening, I want to think about the dictatorship of power taking many different forms in the world. And one of those dictatorships, those despotisms that we don't as often hear about, is the tyranny of the mob. Now, for us here in the gathering now, tyranny of the mob is when so many people are influenced by an idea that, independent of the subtleties of the idea, the errors in that idea, the awkwardness in that idea, all listeners, everybody within earshot, come away with a conclusion about what to do in public policy, how they can make society better. That conclusion, in this tyranny of the mob scenario, that conclusion is simple. It is practical. It tells them what they must do. It moves them to action. It energizes them on public policy. But unfortunately, is dead wrong for the society in which they live. And actually, it undermines what really matters to these people. Now, be clear, I believe people are fundamentally good. And of course, ultimately, it is people who must determine outcomes for the societies in which they live. Economic, social science is about outcomes for the societies in which people live. What do we do, however, when people behave in a way that actually frustrates their own good intentions? This is where you come in. Because you see, the only weapon that we have against tyranny of the mob is evidence. It is research. The protection that societies have against tyranny of the mob is the work that you will be doing as academics and scholars, armed with the discipline and critical thinking that result from your PhD training and preparation. Let me illustrate this by coming to the subject of my talk. That subject is inequality. Now, I take as given that if you're interested in economics, you're interested in social science, you're interested in public policy, you care about the humanity around all of us. And as part of this caring, we want the weak and vulnerable within our midst to become empowered. We want the disadvantaged among us to be able to assert control over their own destiny. This graphic of a discouraged American worker who's been thrown out of a job, who sees real incomes falling, who sees the industrial landscape around him hollowed out, who sees no future for himself or for his children. This person is not able to assert control over his own destiny. And as social scientists in public policy, as economists, what we want is for everyone, but especially the poor, to have enabled, meaningful, satisfying lives. However, what many see in our modern unequal world is a deeply disturbing shift in the opposite direction. This is a graphic from researchers around the world documenting the rise in the income share of the top 1% in different societies. The blue line is the share more recently. The red line is the share longer ago in 1980. And in every society that we document, in every nation that we can measure, the share of the top 1% has risen dramatically. The United States, which appears in the extreme right side of this picture, is the worst among these. Inequality in the United States has risen sharply. The rich have made off with more of what is available than ever before. Now, so for many observers, the world has become richer. We are all more prosperous than we used to be. But even as the whole world has become in totality more prosperous than ever before, than ever seen in the 7 million years of the history of humanity across our planet, within each country, society has become ever more polarized. It has emerged that there is a small elite, well-paid, comfortable, secure, the top 1% on one side, and on the other side, growing ranks of fellow citizens in insecure, low-paid work. Instead of everybody gaining control over their own destiny, it seems that in every country, what many now see are only dim prospects for a better life, that discouraged worker that I showed you earlier. Many across societies have lost dignity, they've lost prospects, they've lost hope. They feel like they're watching from the sidelines as others around them race ahead to ever greater wealth and prosperity. And in this view backed by the evidence that you are all just looking at, the disadvantaged are definitely not gaining control over their own destiny. The weak and vulnerable are not becoming more empowered. Instead, because every nation in the world sees rising inequality, the poor have become poorer. Inequality has immiserized, has made more miserable those already disadvantaged. And this dangerous turn has not gone unnoticed. Indeed, quite the opposite. It attracts the attention from many. Pope Francis, 6 years ago, tweeted, "Inequality is the root of social evil." Around the same time, then President Barack Obama referred to this inequality as the defining challenge of our time. Now, given the reasoning that you and I have just taken to come here, the public policy solution is clear. We need to become scrupulously sensitive to inequality. We need to combat inequality wherever we see it. Hence the title, or at least the first part of the title of my talk, inequality. I now want to change tack. I now want to argue that everything that I've said until now, while it is correct, has been read wrong. That we are thinking about inequality wrong. And I'm going to finish up the talk by arguing in 2 steps and then pointing to more research that needs to be done. Research that PhD students, incoming PhD candidates like yourself can really get your teeth into. So I argue this in 2 steps. The first step, inequality, which is what we're focusing on here, which is what Barack Obama focuses on, Pope Francis focuses on, a lot of our political leaders focus on, a lot of popular media focus on, a lot of tyranny of the mob has latched onto. My first step is that inequality, the gap between rich and poor, does not tell us whether the weak and vulnerable remain unempowered. It does not tell us whether the disadvantaged remain unable to assert control over their own destiny. And it does not tell us whether some in society can achieve enabled, meaningful, satisfying lives. Now, to be sure, in many cases, inequality is indeed a sufficient statistic for that depressing message about the weak and vulnerable, about the disadvantaged. But in other places and at other times, it is not. What rising inequality actually indicates about the plight of humanity actually varies. I'm going to show you evidence in a minute, but just to firm up ideas, remember I referred you to how for most of 7 million years, humanity did not see this kind of inequality. For most of 7 million years, inequality was actually very low. For most of 7 million years, humanity was miserable. Humanity was unempowered. The weak and vulnerable remained disadvantaged because everybody was poor. The absence of inequality does not make life better. Therefore, inequality does not make life necessarily miserable. But in many circumstances, the tyranny of the mob actually is right. So second, continuing to hold on to this simple idea, inequality immiserizes the poor among us. If we continue to hold on to that simple idea, if we don't look at richer evidence, if we give in to tyranny of the mob, it makes for bad public policy. Because unless you are brutally clear about the facts, economics instructs you to be brutally clear about the facts. Public policy instructs you to be the same. Unless you are that way, focusing on inequality only encourages the politics of envy, and it unhelpfully breeds a conversation that divides us all. I'm close, I'm 5 minutes away from the end of my time. Let me use that 5 minutes, 4 minutes of that to talk about evidence. So I'm going to pick 2 economies. And just randomly, I'm going to pick the United States and China. The United States, I already referred you to this dramatic rise of the top 1%. That same picture for China would also show a dramatic rise in the share of the top 1%. Many observers have noted the rise in inequality in both America and China. This graph that I've just put before you shows the situation for the United States. The graph on the left side shows you the gap between rich and poor since the 1980s. That gap has risen dramatically. Inequality has risen. In fact, in America, the top 10%, you can calculate from this picture, have seen their average incomes rise nearly 3 times, while the bottom half of the US population has seen their average incomes fall 8%. So right here in America, in this picture, is a compact summary of exactly what so many observers have in mind. Rising inequality on the left side of this picture, the poor becoming poorer on the right side of this picture. Let me put it bluntly. America is the poster child of the hypothesis that inequality immiserizes the poor. And so the rest of us in the world, we think if that's happening in America, the world's most powerful, most capable, most well-run economy, how else could things be different elsewhere? This is where the evidence becomes more interesting. Turn now to the contrasting view. This is the same graph for China. And in China, the left side of this picture, once again, shows how the rich have pulled away from the rest of society. And they have done so even faster than the United States. In China, the top 10% have seen their average incomes rise tenfold. In America, only threefold. However, and this is the critical point, on the right side of this picture, you see the situation for the bottom half of China's population, the ordinary people. The bottom half of China's population have seen their average incomes rise fourfold. Let me say that again. The poor in China have seen their average incomes rise fourfold, even faster than the rich in America have seen their incomes rise. So let me summarize. Sorry. The situation that I've just described is the situation for America, where the top 10% have seen their incomes rise 3 times. The bottom 50% have seen their incomes fall 8%. Situation for China have seen the rich become even richer. Incomes rise tenfold. But critical point, the poor in China have seen their average incomes rise fourfold. The poor in China have become empowered. The poor in China have seen the weak and vulnerable gain better control of their destiny. Inequality has not been a barrier to the poor in China becoming better off. Now, here is the multi-trillion-dollar question that simply thinking does not get us an answer, but that you and I need to go do research on. Which of the China or America income dynamics is more representative of the world? Should we be concerned about inequality because in the United States, when inequality happens, the poor are immiserized? Or should we look on inequality the same way that inequality happens in China, where the poor have become better off? My calculations show that in 80% of the cases since the Second World War, where inequality has risen, so too have average incomes of the bottom half increased. Put that another way, the world is 80% more like China than the world is like the United States. So let me close. Thinking hard about the world, giving in to the rule of the mob is not going to get us to the right kind of public policy. Only hard research, hard social science research will. We, you and I, interested in economics public policy, we will not be finding the next cure for cancer. The previous speaker will. But what we will do is to make better public policy. So let me close now by talking about the second step in my argument. I have 50 seconds. We need to stop cultivating the politics of envy. When we think of the world around us, we take a snapshot of reality, and our minds theorize based on that mental image that we've taken. And the psychology is a compelling one. That given that static snapshot of reality, the reason the poor are poor is because the rich have so much. We could make the poor not so poor simply by not allowing the rich to not have quite so much. But from the evidence I've told you, there are 2 problems with this reasoning. First, the world is not static. It continues to evolve, and those dynamics, not the static snapshot, should be our concern. Will the subsequent generations that come after us be better off? Will they gain better control of their destiny? That is the question we need to ask. Second, much more worrying, and this is where I end, following the tyranny of the mob, shoehorning the world into a static snapshot, you and I and the mob reduce politics to a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, one group in society gains only by having a different group lose. And in a zero-sum world, there is no concept of cooperation, where all of us work together to produce an outcome that benefits everyone. We only ever envy others. And my ending is to paraphrase Yoda from Star Wars. Because if we're only ever going to be envying others, envy is the path to the dark side. Envy leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. When the world is zero sum, I only ever gain by making you lose, and you gain only by making me lose. Is that the kind of world we want to live in? I invite you all to become PhD students in economics and public policy, save us from tyranny of the mob, and make the world a better place. Thank you very much. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Danny. So there is one question in the Q&A. I think the rest are about continue to write. You can either raise your hands or you can type it down, the questions. So great points. Tarun say, great points, Prof. Danny Quah. Equality of opportunity is more important than equality of outcome. Isn't inequality an obvious outcome of capitalism? For the China example, is it relevant where their starting point was for the poor folks?
Well, those are excellent points. I am in complete agreement that inequality of opportunity is much more important than the inequality or otherwise of outcomes. What we want is a level playing field. Everybody should have a fair shot at playing the game well. Inequality in outcomes is when we acknowledge that the game sometimes has winners, sometimes has losers. The winners should win with good grace. They should not gloat. They should not rub the face of the losers in the mud. Similarly, the losers should acknowledge that if the game has been well played and they have not won this time, they will come back and reuse the opportunity. That's the right way in which we should approach this. Now, that, however, is not the way in which many of us are now conducting our conversations. When we go on social media, when we discuss these things in fora, we are often seized with the sadness of the result, the inequality of the outcome. And I do wish we could move the focus. The problem is that equality of opportunity is sometimes difficult to measure. But I think we should put our minds to that and we should move towards a better narrative. Now, I don't know if it was you or someone else who added in that, does China really matter in this conversation? I say yes. As humanity, our job is not to make judgment on the political or economic systems that others have chosen for themselves. It is what works for them. What we need to be concerned about is the well-being of our fellow humans. And when a society brings out of extreme poverty 627 million people, more than 100 times the population of Singapore, more than 3 times the population of the United States. That is no mean achievement. That's not something that we should say, well, of course it would have to happen. It was easy there. India also has 1 billion people. India also had low incomes. India also had many hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. India still has hundreds of millions of people living in poverty. We could not make the same statement that we've just did about China that we did for India. We still need to repair that social challenge, and we need to do that. Thank you for your question.
Okay, there's another question from Bole Chan. Thank you, Professor Danny Quah, for an enlightening talk. Can you consider mentoring a paper on the political direction of Malaysia in the next 15 to 20 years? Wow.
I am, as an academic, of course, my door is open to mentoring all kinds of papers that are well put together, sensible, objective, evidence-driven, wanting to get at facts, wanting to get to make humanity better off, make society a better place. So obviously, yes.
Okay,
You
there's
can send me your name subsequently. I didn't catch it, but you send me your name afterwards, either in chat or otherwise.
okay. I think there's one question from the panelists. You like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Uh, Hi, Prof. Quah. So
Hi,
very
hi.
interesting talk. So my question is kind of similar to Tarun's question. So I was wondering, comparing the data, could it be big? So we see that US has much lower growth. The population income has grown much less compared to China. Could it be because that at 1980s, because there was a point when we started comparing. So maybe in 1980s, US was already very much better developed than the rest of the world, considering the industrial power of the US and the post-World War II economy. US was relatively unscathed and all that. And so could that be the reason why China grew so much? Is it because the US already was so well developed that they had less space for improvement? And
Well,
also China at that point of time, there was the thing called a Great Leap Forward, which ended in 1976, where the Chinese economy actually shrank and there was a widespread famine. So could that be the reason for this disparity of growth?
Yeah, I mean, excellent points. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but I hope we can continue the conversation afterwards. The Great Leap Forward, of course, as you yourself indicate, turned out to be a total disaster. It was not a leap forward at all. It ended up shrinking the economy. Hundreds of millions of people starved to death. There was famine. It was not a pretty sight. Policymakers, politicians, political leaders of different stripes try out different things on their economies, and obviously we have to be respectful of how people in different societies respond to these kinds of changes. On the United States point, it's true everything that you say. The United States is a more developed society. The United States, had less capacity for rapid growth. All of that is true. That does not explain, however, why the top 1% in America have become so much richer than everybody else. It does not explain why the top 10% of America continue to harvest, continue to grow in their average incomes threefold, while the bottom 50% actually shrank in their per capita incomes. I mean, what is true is that more developed societies grow less quickly. It means that the pie is smaller. It does not tell us that the pie, therefore, must be biased towards the rich. That is still a question of public policy and the operations of the economy. And then the final point is, remember, the evidence that I'm citing, while the headline figure is the one that focuses our mind, is the US and China. But my evidence is not confined to the US and China. My evidence is that 80% of the world behaves more like China than like the United States. And in that 80% of the world, there are also a lot of countries that are developed. There is a smattering, there is a wide scatter of the evolution of inequality across levels of development. And it is a challenge in public policy. It is a choice that people make, that societies make or have made for them, how the trajectory of income distribution evolves. It is a trajectory that our conversations as social scientists and as academics, we need to get involved with. We need to be part of a national conversation from wherever we are that allows the possibility of steering our societies to good outcomes.
Okay, there's another question from Maheshi. This is a wonderful speech, sir. We need to empower the poor so they can rise up to minimize the bridge between the rich and the poor. Also, the government needs to play their part to close the inequality gap by employment. Am I correct?
I think parts of what you say, I fully sign on with. Other parts, I feel a little bit mismatched still. a lot of my talk was about how inequality is the wrong thing to look at. What we are really concerned about is making the weak and vulnerable in our societies better off. We want to lift the poor. Lifting the poor is not the same as reducing inequality. China lifted the poor, but inequality rose even more. Looking at inequality, trying to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor might, in circumstances, certain circumstances, be the right thing to do. It is not the right thing to do in all circumstances. But what it does do everywhere is encourage the politics of envy. Because once you start talking about lifting the poor as a challenge of narrowing the gap between the poor and the rich, you have transformed the conversation into one of envy, into one of the poor looking at the rich and saying the rich have what we need to have too. And that's the wrong direction to take, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are out of time. Thanks for the very inspiring talk, and I think really changing our thinking about it. And hopefully there'll be more people coming and joining your program.